Chairman Furman, welcome back. We very much appreciate your willingness to come and speak with us following the economic report of the President. It's important for us to understand what is in this and get your take on it and where we're going. It certainly helps us in terms of our policy-making decisions going forward. I want to welcome you here and thank you for your participation. Vice Chairman Teaberry, Ranking Member Maloney, and all of us welcome you and thank you for your willingness to continue this long-standing tradition that we have, that the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors testifies before the Joint Economic Committee. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the Council of Economic Advisors and the Joint Economic Committee, both of which were created to advise our respective branches of government on a wide range of matters affecting the economy. We appreciate this annual opportunity to engage in dialogue and look forward to discussing this year's economic report. Much has been learned over the course of this slow growth recovery that we're in, and these lessons will only continue for the foreseeable future. The current recovery has been slower than previous recoveries, and subdued expectations about the economic, population, and labor force growth have placed additional pressures on federal budget constraints. However, I don't accept the often mentioned assertion that we have entered a new normal of slower economic growth. Policy reforms seeking to create a better tax system, rein in spending, and loosen the regulatory shackles restricting our economy can alter this trajectory by removing some of the structural barriers American workers and businesses face today. In my opinion, a lot of the problems we'd like to solve require us as policymakers to look in the mirror and see how current federal government policies are affecting our economy. In his final State of the Union address this year, President Obama stated that he wanted, and I quote here, to focus on the next 5 years, the next 10 years, and beyond. However, he omitted one of the most important issues that America faces in the coming years, the financial obligations that will come due over those time frames, and particularly in the beyond. Debt was not mentioned once in his address, and how to achieve fiscal sustainability was not among the 4 questions the President argued that we as a country have to answer. I found this to be a glaring omission, given how our national debt has risen so sharply over the past 7 years, from $10.6 trillion when President Obama took office to now over $19 trillion. This accumulation of such staggering levels of debt is nothing short of reckless, and the situation will only get worse the longer we wait to address it. According to a recently released report by the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, in just 10 years, spending on mandatory spending programs and interest on the debt will consume nearly 99% of all federal revenues. Clearly, this path is unsustainable. So if we don't work now to correct this disturbing trajectory, our ability to pay for essential government functions will be severely constrained, our economy will suffer, and our national security will be at risk. The CEA's report we will discuss today devotes significant attention to inequality as a defining challenge of the 21st century. However, I think it's important to recognize that intragenerational theft is also a form of inequality, a particularly severe one that our children and grandchildren are poised to inherit. Their ability to succeed in our future economy will depend largely on the decisions that we make today. For the American dream to remain attainable for future generations, we must accept the reality of our fiscal situation and act responsibly by addressing it immediately. I look forward to discussing these issues in more depth with Chairman Furman, and I'll now turn to our Ranking Member Maloney for her opening statement.
Okay, first of all, welcome, Dr. Furman, and thank you for calling this hearing, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Dr. Furman, for appearing yet again before us today to answer questions about the current state of the U.S. economy. I share the overall assessment of the economic report of the President that under the leadership of President Obama, the nation's economy is back on track after what was the worst recession since the Great Depression. We have just completed the best 2 years of private sector job growth since the 1990s. We have recorded the fastest 2-year drop in the annual average unemployment rate in 30 years. The unemployment rate has been cut in half. As you can see in this chart, we're in the midst of the longest streak of private sector job creation in history, with a record 71 straight months of growth in the creation of 14 million private sector jobs. There are some who look lightly at these achievements, claiming that the Obama recovery pales in comparison to average, quote, average recoveries, as if the economic meltdown during the last years of the Bush administration was, quote, an average recession. Is the loss of almost 9 million American jobs average? Is the loss of homes for 9 million Americans average? Let's remember, when George Bush left the Oval Office, the economy was in a death spiral. In the final quarter of 2008, GDP shrank at a staggering 8.2% annual rate, the worst quarterly economic performance in more than 50 years. Housing prices were collapsing. U.S. households lost nearly $13 trillion. Dr. Furman, last year you told us that this recession was like an economic heart attack. You said the share of wealth lost in the early days of this recession was almost 5 times as large as the loss in wealth that triggered the Great Depression. Thanks to the bold action of President Obama, Democrats in Congress, and the Federal Reserve, we have steadily climbed back from this recession. As you can see from this chart, the U.S. GDP has grown in 24 of the past 26 quarters. Real GDP has grown by over 14% since the start of the Obama administration. The auto industry, written off by some as dead, has already added nearly 640,000 new jobs since 2009, and it is now exporting more than 2 million units per year. Average housing prices have rebounded to 2007 levels, and household wealth is more than 17 trillion higher than before the recession. This recovery has occurred despite efforts by many Republicans in Congress. First, they opposed stimulating the economy. In fact, every single one of them in the House voted against the Recovery Act. They demanded budget cuts at exactly the time when economic theory says government should increase spending to boost demand. The report notes that the economy faces long-term structural challenges. First of all, the baby boomers are retiring. That alone will decrease labor force participation and slow the growth of GDP. We also face the devastating effects of offshoring of American jobs and job losses due to automation and technical changes. These challenges are not a surprise. They have been on economists' radar for years. So what should we do? I agree with your assessment that we need to rebuild the nation's crumbling infrastructure, invest in early childhood education, implement paid leave, achieve equal pay for equal work, and make college more affordable. I want to close by looking at economic inequality, one of the central issues of our time, and the focus of the first and fourth chapters of the economic report of the President. The U.S. experience has diverged from other advanced countries. Since 1987, the share of income going to the top 1% in the United States has been greater than every other G7 country every single year. We need to recommit ourselves to policies that expand opportunities and narrow inequality. These policies will pay dividends in the future and help us create an economy that is even more robust, an economy where the benefits of growth are shared across the income spectrum. As you note, giving all people a fair shot will strengthen our economy by boosting productivity and accelerating growth. Dr. Furman, thank you once again for appearing before the committee. I am eager to hear your testimony, and congratulations on an excellent report.
Thank you, Ranking Member Maloney. And now we turn to introducing our distinguished witness, Chairman Furman. Jason Furman is the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. Previously, he served as the principal deputy director at the National Economic Council and senior vice president of the World Bank. He has also been a senior fellow in economic studies and director of the Hamilton Project at the Brookings Institution. Dr. Furman earned his PhD in economics and a master in arts in government from Harvard University and a master in science and economics from the London School of Economics. Thank you, Chairman Furman, for joining us. We look forward to hearing from your report.
Thank you, Chairman Coates, Vice Chairman Teaberry, Ranking Member Maloney, and members of the committee. We're excited to be here today to talk about the 70th Annual Economic Report of the President, something that the CEA and this committee have had a chance to do many times over the decades. This report's overall macroeconomic theme is that 2015 was a year of continued growth for the U.S. economy in the face of substantial headwinds from abroad. Ranking Member Maloney cited a number of the statistics: the strongest job growth in 2 years, in 2 years of job growth in a decade, the largest decline in the unemployment rate in 30 years, and the longest streak of private sector job growth on record. The unemployment rate has consistently fallen well faster than what anyone would expect, falling to 4.9% in February 2008, as compared to forecasts, which as recently as 2014 had expected it to stay above 5% through 2020. At the same time, the labor force participation rate has been relatively stable over the past year, as improving economic conditions partially offset the drag on participation from the retirement of the baby boom generation. And perhaps most importantly, over the past 6 months, nominal hourly earnings for private sector workers have grown at their fastest pace since the Great Recession, although more work remains to be done to boost wages. Our domestic progress is all the more notable in light of the substantial headwinds that the United States faces from the global economy. The International Monetary Fund estimates that global economic growth was 3.1% in 2015, the slowest since 2009, and continuing a trend of falling below expectations. The United States had the highest growth rate of any major advanced economy, but slowing growth in a number of large emerging markets weighed heavily on the global economy in 2015. Weak growth abroad served as a drag on U.S. exports, with exports subtracting 0.1 percentage point from real GDP growth in 2015, a substantial shift from the half point that exports had been adding to growth in 2013 and 14, and we expect these headwinds to continue into the year 2016. Particularly in light of these adverse global developments, it's important that we work to strengthen domestic growth by boosting productivity and dynamism in the U.S. economy. It's also important that we work to ensure that the benefits of economic growth are shared broadly. And to this end, the 2016 Economic Report of the President lays out the President's agenda for inclusive growth. Despite progress since the Great Recession, the unequal distribution of income, wealth, and opportunity remains one of the greatest challenges facing our economy. It's not unique to the United States, but it's more severe here than in other countries around the world. Some of the increase we've seen is a natural consequence of competitive markets, a result of differences in productivity as technology evolves. But some of the increase may reflect the rising influence of what economists call economic rents, the income captured by companies and workers beyond what their productivity justifies. The apparent increase in rents in recent decades and their overall increasingly unequal distribution have contributed to overall inequality without boosting productivity, providing opportunities to improve both efficiency and equity in the U.S. economy. The President's agenda includes making competitive markets work better by increasing opportunity and combating the trend of rising, unequally divided rents. Competition most effectively promotes economic growth when it is open to the widest pool of talent. So the President is promoting equality of opportunity by investing in education, supporting children in low-income families, and ensuring a fair criminal justice system. And the President also supports policies to make markets more competitive by reducing overall economic rents through promoting more open and competitive markets, balanced intellectual property rules, and a smarter approach to occupational licensing regulation, among other policies. Other sections of this year's report lay out additional steps we can and should take to ensure a strong domestic economy, including expanding trade, investing in technology, investing in infrastructure, and investing in children. And I'd be more than happy to talk about these or any other topics that you're interested in. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. I want to apologize for having to leave shortly. The Senate has called for 4 consecutive votes, which will take a considerable amount of time. I'm going to ask my question to you and then turn this over to Mr. Teaberry, our Vice Chairman, who will recognize Mrs. Maloney as ranking member. And then in this somewhat Byzantine order of who came first and which chamber you are from and what is your seniority, we will try to do a fair allocation of back and forth. And I have someone here who has studied assiduously and an expert on telling you, Vice Chairman, who's next.
Okay.
And trust me, with people in and out, back and forth, it can get very complicated. Mr. Chairman, I came to office a long time ago. One of the very first critical votes I had to face was the decision as to whether or not we would raise our debt ceiling limit to over $1 trillion. People say, wow, that must have been 100 years ago. No, not quite. That was 1981. Today, we're at the 19 trillion mark. Look, let's take the politics out of this. We had 3 years of balanced budgets at the end of the 1900s before we came into this new millennium. Under both Republican control and Democrat control, we have seen an ever-accelerating plunge into debt. We know that the Darth Vader of the future economy is lurking out there, waiting to collect the bills. We know that from CBO, the projections going forward are dramatic relative to the way discretionary spending shrinks as mandatory spending continues to grow. In fact, CBO said that in 10 years, we will, at the current trend, be at 99%. 99% of our budget will be consumed by mandatory spending and interest coverage. This obviously is unacceptable. We know the baby boom era has been descending upon us. So we've known this for decades. And so if we can take the politics out of all this as to who to blame and who's responsible and simply say we now, whether you're a Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, or in between on that spectrum, we have a common challenge that has to be addressed. It has been pushed down the road over and over and over. It is becoming increasingly a hindrance to our economy and ability to grow, to provide for our national security, to pave roads, to build infrastructure, to provide for health care, research, and you name the functions that are necessary to be addressed. So I wonder if you would tell us what is the next president, regardless of who that is, what is the next president and the next Congress? What do they need to do to finally stand up to this looming crisis, to put in place a long-term solution that is feasible in terms of how we need to govern, but will put us on a path to more fiscal responsibility and avoid this coming wall that we're going to hit if we don't take action. I may not be able to be here to hear your final answer on that, but we'd like it for the record, and I'd appreciate it if you would address that. That's my only question. Then I'll turn it over to Mr. Teaberry.
So thank you very much for that question, and I think I agree with the premise of almost everything that you said. I think it's important to put this in context. Our deficit was nearly 10% of GDP when the president walked in the door. That was a consequence of a very severe recession. The deficit has come down to 2.5% of GDP, which is below the average of the last 40 years.
But we know it's going to spike shortly, right?
Absolutely. And that's due to a combination of deficit reduction and also a strengthening economy. Doug Elmendorf, the former CBO director, recently co-wrote a paper in which he argued that the fiscal outlook over the next 25 years is a challenge, as you said, but is less of a challenge than it looked a couple of years ago, in part because of the steps we've taken, in part because of lower interest rates. But more does need to be done. The deficit will rise as a share of GDP. The debt will rise as a share of GDP. And our approach is a balanced combination of measures on the spending side, including to entitlements, and measures on the tax side, which predominantly are not about raising rates, but are about cutting back on tax benefits for high-income households, many of which aren't economically efficient. The last thing I should say is that ultimately our goal is to see the debt-to-GDP ratio on a downward path and stabilized. One can accomplish that both by lowering debt, but also by raising GDP. So steps that strengthen our economy are a really important part of how we need to deal with our debt and deficit as well.
Thank you. We finished 12 seconds ahead of, 12 seconds behind my time, so I need to pass this on to Mr. T. Berry. Again, apologize for having to leave. Hope to be back as quickly as I can.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will recognize the ranking member, Mrs. Maloney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. A major focus of the economic report of the president is widening economic inequality. And your report argues that extreme inequality can be a macroeconomic problem, a drag on productivity and growth. Please explain to even those who aren't concerned about the growing gap between the haves and the have-nots why we should be concerned about inequality and why is vast inequality everybody's problem.
Thanks for your question. And I think there's a number of reasons. One of the clearest is that if you have inequality of income, you're going to have inequality of opportunity. And if you have inequality of opportunity, there's talent that could be contributing more to our economy but won't get the shot that it should get because lacking educational and other opportunities. So we'll miss out on the innovation and creativity we need to push us forward.
Okay. As you noted in your testimony, the share of income going to the top 1% in the United States is much higher than in other G7 countries. And why has the experience in the United States been so different from the other G7 countries?
All of our economies are facing similar forces in terms of technology and globalization, and those have played a role in rising inequality across the advanced economies. One thing that's happened in the United States, though, is we have made less of an investment in education that would let our workers keep up with the skills that would complement the advances we've seen in technology or to take advantage of globalization. So that's one reason why we've seen an increase in inequality. I think also institutional changes matter. The fact that the United States has a minimum wage that is very low by the standards of the G7, has been eroded substantially by inflation, has also been a contributing factor to the increase in inequality.
Many people understand that expanding economic opportunity for women in the workplace and paying them fairly is the right thing to do. Why is it also good for the broader economy?
One of the challenges we face in our economy is a demographic challenge, that we're an increasingly aging society, and that has slowed the growth of our labor force. One of the ways to increase the growth of our labor force would be to incorporate both more men and women in the workforce. And when you take steps like more flexible workplaces, more subsidies for child care, reducing the tax penalty on secondary earners, and other measures along those lines, paid leave, all of that helps bring more women into the workforce and helps us overcome some of the demographic challenges we have built into our age structure.
And people understand that programs like Head Start and Universal Pre-K are an effective tool for helping children succeed in life. What are the economic benefits for allowing all of our children to have this opportunity of pre-K?
Right. Recently, economic research has been taking advantage of studies that follow children over a very long period of time after public policies, and they found that high-quality preschool, for example, raises future earnings substantially and raises them more than enough to justify the initial cost of the program. High-quality preschool also, by the way, helps women's labor force participation. So it helps today the family as a whole and balance work and family, and then it helps the children later on. That's true of a wide range of interventions, the Earned Income Tax Credit, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, and Medicaid all have been shown to have long-term benefits for children in terms of education, earnings, and health.
When the United States Congress instituted automatic spending cuts in 2013, did it help or hurt the economy?
That hurt the economy. It created a fiscal headwind.
Well, my time has expired. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Good afternoon, Chairman Furman. Thanks for joining us today. In his letter to Congress introducing the ERP, President Obama says, and I quote, "I have never been more optimistic about America's future than I am today." However, the chart that I have, hopefully on the screen here in a second, shows that path growth projections from the administration have not lived up to expectations. They've failed. And that now, by the administration's own estimates, the long-term growth potential is meager at best. So the red is OMB's forecast, the solid black line is actual, and the dotted black line is the new projection going forward, and then the various blue lines are other nonpartisan organizations. And you can see the growth, GDP growth, is between 2 and 2.5%, which is below the historic averages. As you know, business investment is essential to economic growth, job creation, and rising living standards. And it has slowed dramatically in the last 2 years. So you describe an optimistic and a pessimistic view of the future trend in business investment within your report. So are you optimistic or pessimistic?
Thank you so much for that question. Of course, I'm optimistic, and that optimism depends, both on the inherent strengths of the U.S. economy and also the policy measures that we can take. If you look at the unemployment rate, and I had shown that chart in my initial presentation, that has consistently fallen faster than our forecasts. Interest rates have come in below our forecasts, and the goal of these forecasts is to forecast the budget deficit, which has also generally come in at less than what we had expected. So a number of things have come in ahead of expectations. I think you're right, though, on that business investment across all the advanced economies, the UK, the Eurozone, Japan, has not been, what we'd like to see, and I think a lot of that is the consequence of the very deep recession. The bright spot within business investment is research and development by private companies is the highest it's been as a share of GDP.
So you yourself mentioned the importance of GDP growth to the Chairman, Mr. Coates' question regarding our debts and our long-term debt. So Larry Summers, who you know, recently talked about secular stagnation, his hypothesis that sees low capital investment, slow labor growth, and slow technological progress as lasting conditions long-term. Is secular stagnation the same as the pessimistic view in the ERP? Or how do you explain it? And do you agree with it?
I guess I interpret secular stagnation as a specific economic hypothesis about long-term equilibrium interest rates and the like. I think it has a number of problems in its application to the United States. I think it may help us understand places like Japan and the Eurozone. I don't think it applies to the United States. That being said, I think the impetus that we need to take big, bold steps, like invest more in our infrastructure, are very much true, and we would have a brighter future if we did that.
Okay, last question. I got a chart up here. I was disappointed the ERP does not address what I believe is the limiting effect on economic growth potential from a whole host of the administration's actions and policies, like increased spending, debt, failure to reform the tax code, and the regulatory burden through regulations. For example, on this chart, it shows historic and projected greenhouse gas emissions, including the effects of the President's Clean Power Plan and specifically the Paris Pledge. These policies and regulations aren't even mentioned in the ERP, and the administration has apparently turned away from the all of the above energy strategy that it was once in favor of, as it now closes power plants and funds natural gas and nuclear power. So we've also seen this administration pour on new financial, labor regulations, environmental regulations. Aren't those holding down economic growth, and aren't there not massive costs associated with such decline in emissions, for instance, on this chart? And these policies, none of them, which I just mentioned, are included in this economic report. Shouldn't the ERP discuss the most important issues impacting our economy and explain that some government policies might constrain economic growth?
To some degree, when you don't see something in the report, it's just a matter of space, and we already imposed 430 pages on you. You mentioned taxes. Last year, for example, we had a long discussion of business tax reform, and I would hope you'd find a lot to agree with in that discussion, the importance of lowering our rates and making our international system more competitive. We just didn't repeat that again this year, not because it's not important, just a matter of space. On regulations, I suspect we probably see it a little bit differently, and certainly our analysis of the determinants of investment growth in the economy finds the trajectory of investment growth we've seen is very well explained by a traditional model that doesn't take into account these regulatory changes. And the investment we've seen, performance in the U.S. economy has been very similar to other economies that have had very different regulatory trajectories. So I don't think they're a very important factor in explaining this macro phenomenon.
Thank you. My time's expired. Mr. Byers, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Furman, the report notes that, quote, while investment has been low, the rate of payouts to shareholders by non-financial firms in the form of dividends or net share buybacks has been rising. Non-financial corporations are now returning nearly half of the funds that could be used for investment to stockholders. One possible explanation provided by the report is that, quote, the rise in payouts to shareholders may be related to the decline in the startup rate, as young firms are more likely to reinvest their cash flow than mature firms. The report also notes that the lower investment growth and higher share of funds returned to shareholders suggests firms had more cash than they thought they could profitably reinvest. However, the rise in share buybacks predates current economic circumstances. Senator Baldwin, among others, has pointed to a 1982 SEC rule that provided for a safe harbor from manipulation liability at the beginning of the explosion of stock buybacks. Prior to 1982, buybacks were a very limited use of corporate profits. And buybacks, as we know, can make earnings reports look better and improve short-term executive compensation and foster short-term thinking in the corporate governance. Can you comment on the impact of this and other regulatory changes have contributed to the current investment environment, and should we be seeking to limit buybacks as a means of promoting private sector investment?
So thank you for your question. I've certainly seen the hypothesis put forward that 1982 regulation has played a role in the rise of buybacks. And it's certainly the case that buybacks have risen over time. It's not just a recent phenomenon. I haven't reviewed the research in terms of assessing that link, so I don't have an opinion on that. I'd be happy to look into it a little bit more and get back to you. I think, one of the most important questions for us to ask, though, is, what can we do to make sure companies have good things to invest in and make sure that we have a really dynamic system in which new businesses are being formed and coming into existence. And if you have a large mature company that doesn't have great investment projects, I'd rather that money go back to shareholders, and then the shareholders can allocate it to some other part of the economy that could be of higher efficiency. So I usually step back and look a little bit less at where the money is going and a little bit more at what's shaping the business decisions and the business opportunities in terms of the real investment prospects they have.
Great. Thank you very much. The ERP contains a very interesting discussion of the impact of economic rents as a driver of inequality, and I like your simple definition was economic rents is income captured by companies and workers beyond that which their productivity justifies. Rents can also be created by market consolidation and regulations which favor a specific business or sector of industry over its competitors. Can you recommend policy approaches to address the undeserved rents?
Sure. One is something that with Senators Lee and Senators Klobuchar held a hearing on a few weeks ago, which is occupational licensing. The fact that at the state level now 25% of occupations you need a license to get. That reduces your ability to move between jobs. If you're one of the lucky people with a license, it lets you command a premium. Land use restrictions that drive up the cost of living in certain areas also create rents, both literally and in the economic sense. Greater degree of competition is important in this regard. But the other thing I'd say is some rents are inevitable, and it's a question of how they're divided. So a higher minimum wage or expanding workers' voice, including labor unions, would help make sure that when you're dividing that pie, it gets divided a little bit more towards the labor end.
Great, thank you. Mr. Chairman, we keep hearing about mandatory spending continue to increase, and that at some point in our lifetimes, it'll be 100% of federal revenues. Do we have a plan to address this, the long-term thinking about what we're going to do to maintain a meaningful discretionary part of our budget?
We currently have much lower projected health care, both level and growth rates going forward than the projections 6 or 7 years ago, and that's in part due to the Affordable Care Act and in part due to a set of changes that were underway in our health system, and continuing to implement that, which is most of the job of our administration, is really important. We could also take additional steps modeled on that bring down the cost of health care, helping to reduce premiums, extend the life of Medicare, and reducing the pressure on discretionary spending that you cited in your question.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Paulson is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Furman, for being here and following up on the report. And, it's interesting to me because some of the numbers you cited and that the other side often cites in terms of numbers, and the economy's back on track. We've had the fastest, we've had the best, and we've had records. Now, here's another number that I think is really critical. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics announced that for all of 2015, all of last year, that we had U.S. productivity, labor productivity rose only 0.6%. So this is the 5th year in a row where that growth has been below 1%. So since the U.S. started collecting this data, going back all the way to 1947, up until now, there has never, ever been such a poor 5-year stretch because we've had 5 years in a row where it's been below 1%. So knowing that's the case, this is really important. The link between increases in labor productivity and the average U.S. standard of living. One example now estimates, for instance, because of the annual increases in labor productivity of 3%, if you had 3%, the average standard of living would double in just about 24 years here in the United States. But now, if you compare that to the last 5 years we've had with low productivity growth, we've actually changed it where the average standard of living won't be doubled until every 139 years. So 139 years to double our standard of living. So these are numbers, I think, that are behind what many people feel or sense. They feel it's the disappearing of the American dream. And it's probably why 72% of the public feels we're in a recession right now, even though technically we're not. So I'm not a doctor, but one of the, I think the rules that we have in medicine is do no harm. So just in terms of that question, Mr. Furman, to what end do you or the administration, what thoughts have you given, what analysis have you provided, or do you acknowledge that the cumulative effect of a lot of regulations on small, on medium, on large businesses has had on a lack of productivity growth and the effect that that is having now on a lower standard of living in the United States?
Thank you for your question, and I think you're right to identify productivity as one of the biggest challenges our economy faces. An analysis by the San Francisco Fed put the date at around 2004 when productivity growth started to slow. It's something we've seen, as I've said in other contexts, across a range of other countries. The United States, and one of the reasons I'm optimistic about the United States is over the last 10 years, we have had the fastest productivity growth of any of the other G7 economies, but we certainly have not had enough. As you said, that places a big role in terms of what future we can expect for wage growth. And so I think the most important question is what steps can we take? I would suggest expanding markets abroad through steps like TPP, reforming our business tax system, lowering the rate and reforming the base, investing more in infrastructure, investing more in research and development, and bringing down our deficit to free up more private capital for investment are 5 really important steps we could take to increase our productivity growth.
And I would agree, tax reform, expanded trade opportunities, sell more American goods and services overseas, get the money back home. But what about the regulatory environment? I mean, do you acknowledge, or have you done analysis just on the weight of regulations from a cumulative effect that has actually had? I mean, it's a consistent message that I hear from my employers that I visit with in Minnesota all the time.
I think it's very important to get regulations right, and one of our jobs at CEA is to participate in the process by which executive branch regulations are reviewed, and we take that responsibility very seriously and work hard to get the benefits as high relative to the costs as you possibly can. Often that means doing regulations in a way that is flexible, that uses market mechanisms. And I think if you do that, it can be consistent with a stronger economy and strong productivity growth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Congressman Delaney is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to welcome Chairman Furman and thank you for your very intelligent report and testimony here today. It also has pretty significant throw weight associated with it, so it's a great work product as usual. I was going to ask about economic rents, but my friend from Virginia already covered that. So I wanted to actually go back to a point that was raised by the chairman about the Paris Accord and thinking about this debate about economic growth as it relates to how we position the country around climate change. So when you think of 2 postures, one that is more forward-leaning as it relates to climate change, in other words, setting goals like 50% clean electricity by 2030, or various goals that are achievable based on current technology but aspirational, stretch goals, versus not taking these steps, right, and not putting the proper incentives in. How do you think about that as it relates, putting aside environmental stewardship, but just as a pure matter of economics? Which posture will drive greater economic growth for the United States?
I think acting as soon as possible to create as predictable a path for the future, and one that, as you said, is achievable but a little bit of a stretch to make sure we're challenging ourselves, is the thing that makes the most economic sense, especially in a world where most every other country in the world is doing the same thing. And so some of the progress we've seen in solar energy, in wind, in conserving energy, all of that is helping to make sure jobs are located here in the United States.
And when you think about job creation opportunity in carbon-intensive industries versus non-carbon intensive industries, what does the data suggest in terms of both where there's likely to be more economic growth, but also this notion, and I may be wrong about this, but my sense is that the carbon-intensive industries have become much more automated and therefore are not actually driving labor. And in fact, they're net, even as they produce the same amount of energy, they're net reducing their labor participation in the industries, versus the clean energy, green energy, whatever you want to call it, to actually tend to be more labor intensive. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, so that's my understanding as well, that a lot of the traditional carbon-intensive industries are very capital-heavy. It is a continuum, though. So, natural gas, for example, has carbon, but it has half as much carbon beginning to end as coal would have, and we've had substantial increases in natural gas production that's helped create jobs in our country And I think that's a good thing and something that we would welcome and encourage. It's also something that's compatible with how we're trying to hit our goals for climate change. But then solar and wind and a range of renewables and the set of industries around those, as you said, are very labor intensive.
And then when you think about economic risk or threats to American prosperity, if you will, because as we've seen from the economic performance that this country has realized across the last 7 years, particularly relative to our competitors, which this might be one of the greatest periods of time when we've outpaced the rest of the world in terms of how we've recovered to the financial crisis and how well our economy is doing relative to other places and how less dependent we are on other parts of the world. And so things like what's happening in the developed world are affecting us less than anywhere else. But when we think about that threat, Mark Carney, the chairman of the Bank of England, gave a speech about a year ago where he talked about one of the risks to financial markets that he saw was, in fact, climate change, because he said there might be a point in time when people actually, it may not be when some of the catastrophic scenarios occur, but when people actually come to the view that it will be a reality and there's a dramatic repricing of assets based on that. How do you think about that in terms of risk to our economy if we don't deal with it in a prudent way?
Right. So,
And you have macro views as to how much climate change could hurt our economy.
right. So we, the administration has what is called the social cost of carbon. It's an estimate of how much each ton of carbon costs us economically. Our estimate is about $40 a ton that we use as an input into the rulemaking process. That estimate does not include the uncertainty and tail risks associated with climate change, and that's a lot of what Mark Carney was talking about in that speech you referred to, and that might even be a larger and more consequential cost than just this. And then at the other end, the sooner you deal with it, the cheaper and more efficient it is. If you waited 30 years, it would be quite costly to our economy to address.
Great. Well, thank you, Chairman.
Thank you.
Senator Lee is addressed for, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Furman, for coming to testify today. And I want to thank you also, once again, for coming to testify on occupational licensing just last month in the Judiciary Committee. I'd like to speak with you about innovation and get your thoughts on a piece of your report that focused on the potential job market effects of robots. It seems that we might be nearing a really significant technological inflection point, one that could have profound implications for our economy. Boston Dynamics continues to release videos of robots with incredible mobility and coordination, while industrial applications involving machine learning and analytical algorithms that at some level simulate cognition continue to advance. Some observers have suggested that we may be on the edge of a new wave of innovation, and that this new wave of innovation might in some ways be similar to that which was spurred on by the invention of the internal combustion engine, for example, which of course effectively led to a really sharp and economically significant decline in the use of horses. First of all, as policymakers, should we be thinking about automation as a discrete issue, or is it better thought of as a piece of a larger challenge involving globalization, trade, and a number of other similar factors? I'm referring in particular to the challenges facing lower skilled, lower income workers and their jobs.
I think that's a great question, and it's something that I know I grapple with all the time. I think to some degree that's all one set of issues, but I think automation brings it to the fore in a very direct way. In theory, automation shouldn't present any problem at all. We've had automation for thousands of years, and we always find more jobs for people. But in practice, that can come at a cost, either in terms of inequality, if you don't have the skills to benefit from it, or some people who get displaced don't find another job, and you might call it transitional or temporary, but that could last for decades.
Right, right, and which is part of why I raised the question here. This one could be different in some ways, and I was looking to try to stay ahead of the curve. Now, your report estimates a high likelihood that jobs today paying less than $20 per hour will eventually be automated. There doesn't seem to be a hard timetable for that projection, but is that accurate?
That's accurate, and we were drawing on research that was done at Oxford in that regard. McKinsey has also done their own research that reaches similar conclusions to what's presented there.
Yeah, the current administration, of course, supports raising the minimum wage, and obviously every policy has trade-offs. That's what we try to hash out in these debates, and one of the things that we discuss in this committee are the economic implications of policies like that one. But if low-paying jobs are the ones that are most threatened, potentially threatened by automation, doesn't raising the minimum wage just raise the cost of low-skilled work and incentivize employers to accelerate the process of automating these jobs, the very jobs that we're perhaps most concerned about?
Right. I mean, the evidence that I've seen for moderate increases in the minimum wage phased in over time, similar to the types of proposals that have been put forward in Congress, has found that they don't have adverse effects on employment. But certainly, if you were to raise the minimum wage to $30 an hour, you know, I would expect you would have a trade-off.
At some point, you're going to get there to a trade-off, and perhaps when you factor in the effects of automation, that trade-off could end up being significant.
I think it's important. It's part of an overall strategy that makes sure our workers have, you know, more skills and more productivity.
Got it. And I want to be clear. I'm not trying to get you to disavow the president's policies here. I know that's not something that's going to happen, certainly not in this forum and not in your current position. But what I'm asking is, if our goal as a society is that an honest day's work should earn an honest day's wage, and machines are going to make it harder, and in some cases perhaps impossible, for low-skilled, entry-level Americans to find an honest day's work, doesn't the basic design of our social safety net have to perhaps look a lot different than it does today?
I think it certainly has implications for how we design our social safety net, and I think that's an important conversation to have. I wouldn't throw out the lessons of the last 50 years, and we have a certain idea of what's worked and what's not. I think minimum wage has worked. I think earned income tax credit has worked. But I think we should be thinking hard about these questions going forward as well.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Furman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Klobuchar is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you. Sorry that Senator Coates and I have had a number of votes going on here. I appreciate the words about the improvement in the economy. I think we've all seen that. Our state is down to 3.8% unemployment. But we also know there are challenges. You raised one, Mr. Chairman, about income inequality. We have challenges for workers that are retired and have issues with their pensions. In fact, right behind you there, who I'm going to meet with later, Sherman Limitainen, who's from northern Minnesota, spent his whole life, started as a janitor, was then a Teamster, has issues with his pension because of a decision that is inordinately affecting a lot of states in the Midwest that we're trying to work on. But another issue up in northern Minnesota that I know that you're well aware of is the current employment situation with the iron ore mining affected by the overproduction in many countries, combined with illegal steel dumping that we know is going on. And I've really appreciated the recent moves of the administration to try to be more aggressive in the enforcement, including adding nearly 40 new inspectors to the ships from the budget money we got last year, as well as working on the enforcement actions, including some new tariffs today. Could you talk about that industry and what's going on and what you think the future is?
Yeah, thank you. And that's this is an issue we do pay a lot of attention to, Senator. The backdrop for this is that there's substantial global overcapacity in steel, and that steel capacity is 70% outside of OECD economies, much of it in economies that have made very heavy state investments in supporting their steel industries. This overcapacity has collided with a collapse in worldwide demand for a range of commodities and products, including steel, and the result has been a 35% decline in steel prices in 2015, which is having a significant impact on our industry and on your state, among others. We have, as you said, taken 149 anti-dumping and countervailing duty actions, 40 of them in 2015 alone. It's the highest rate of actions in at least 14 years. That has contributed to the fact that steel imports are down 13% over the last year. And we're going to continue to rigorously enforce our trade laws, including taking advantage of some of the new tools that Congress gave us with the customs enforcement bill that the President signed, I believe, last week. It's important to understand that it can't, that domestic trade enforcement is an important part of the answer, but international coordination is also critical. U.S. imports represent only 10% of global exports, and we need to be working together with other countries, both steel importing countries who are dealing with many of the same issues our economy is, as well as steel exporting countries like China, to push on their overcapacity.
Very good. Well, as I said, it's the President's Chief of Staff came up to northern Minnesota. We've had thousands of layoffs, and it was really helpful to have him there. And I'm going to ask you more on the in writing some questions about this pension issue, but could you just talk in general about the importance in a volatile economy? You've got on the one hand the millennials dealing with the gig economy and having trouble saving because they don't have that kind of structure in place that we once had, and then you have some seniors who have retired, but things change with their pensions, and it makes it very difficult for them. So could you talk about just this importance in general of retirement?
Yeah, retirement security is very important. A lot of people are not prepared for retirement, and retirement security is enhanced when you're depending on multiple sources, Social Security, of course, being one, private savings being another, and pensions. Pensions include both defined contribution and defined benefit. Defined benefit have faced a number of challenges in our economy, especially in the multi-employer segment, and that's an important issue. And the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation plays an important role in helping to make sure that those pensions function as well as they can.
Okay. And, you know, this issue with the Central States Pension Plan, which we can talk about more in the future, is affecting 2/3 of the 400,000 participants are going to have their pensions reduced as high as 70%. And so it's a real big concern in northern Minnesota, which is the same place where all the layoffs are occurring especially. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Congressman Grothman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks for calling on me, and Chairman Furman, I'm honored to have a chance to be on a committee that you're testifying before. One of the things I think we can all agree about is the labor participation right now is a little bit disappointing. And when I get around my district, one of the big complaints employers have is they have a hard time finding employees. Okay. On the other hand, they also feel that their major competition for those employees is the government itself, because of all the government benefits that you get if you don't work or don't work as hard as you can. You mentioned that the unemployment rate has dropped during the Obama administration, which it has, but at the same time the unemployment has dropped, SNAP enrollment has gone up by 12 million, okay? So it seems as though we're paying people either not to work at all or not to work to their abilities. Could you comment on whether or not you feel all of the benefits out there that are available to you if you're making less money are contributing to the low labor participation rate or contributing to people not achieving their full potential?
Right, so thank you for your question. For men between the age of 25 and 54, their labor force participation rate has fallen nearly every year since the 1950s. So this is a very long-standing phenomenon. For women, since the late 1990s, this happened even though we changed our social assistance system to be much less something that you'd get regardless of whether or not you were working, to something that you pretty much, in most cases, really requires you to work to get. In fact, many elements of our social assistance system.
I'm going to take it to a certain extent. You're talking about earned income tax credit there, which requires you to work a little, but as soon as you work more than a little, they begin to take it away. But go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say the evidence on the earned income tax credit is that it does increase labor force participation because people deciding whether to work or not work, it's a several $1,000s difference. And then you're right, there's a phase-in range and a phase-out range, and those could have effects as well, but those appear to be dominated by the large amount of money that you get as an additional bonus for working.
I'm going to disagree with you, but I'm going to mention another problem we have. Economists have found there's a positive correlation between stable two-parent households and better outcomes for families. Now, it's not very difficult to come up with hypotheticals in which people are losing over 30,000, a single parent could lose over $30,000 a year by getting married. Do you view, and I'm hearing exact examples of that in my district, you know, parents saying, my son can't get married, we lose the benefits, that sort of thing. Can you think of anything you can do in the remaining time of this administration, or any plans for the future that you can suggest for future administrations to do something about this huge marriage penalty we have right now?
Thanks for your question. President Bush passed meaningful marriage penalty relief for many middle-class families, which President Obama signed into law on a permanent basis. There's a substantial marriage penalty in the earned income tax credit that was reduced in 2009 that we just made permanent on a bipartisan basis this past December. And then one of the proposals in the president's budget, which I alluded to in response to a question from Ranking Member Maloney, it gets at the fact that secondary earners often face higher tax rates in the United States than many other countries, and it can discourage them from working. And so we have a tax benefit for secondary earners that we've proposed.
Will you agree, though, that we still have over a $30,000 penalty, say, for a single parent making, with a couple of kids, making 10 to 15 grand a year? If they do marry somebody making 40 or 50 grand a year, do you agree with those figures?
I think for most middle-class families, we don't have a marriage penalty in the tax code anymore because of the steps
I'm not
we've
saying
taken.
the tax code, I'm taking all the benefits, the earned income tax, the SNAP program, the low-income
I'd
housing.
be, I don't, that's higher than I would have put the number at, and in part because we have taken a number of steps, but there's certainly more we can do.
Okay, yeah, I'll have to get you those figures. I'll give you one more question. Before you talked about the fact that you felt we cut spending too much in whatever, 2011, 2010, and it would have been better not to. And, okay, so I take it you're kind of what a Keynesian economist, you kind of believe that deficit spending improves the economy. In the budget that President Obama has recently submitted to Congress, you also have a larger deficit. It always kind of makes me wonder about you folks, and I love all people, but if the time to run a deficit is when the economy is weak, as it was in 2010, 2011, and now that we've had such a long period of time of lower employment, though our incomes aren't what we want, and you're still running a large deficit, is there ever a time that economists such as yourself would suggest running a surplus?
The goal that we have in mind is having the debt on a declining path relative to the size of the economy, so that you're shrinking it relative to the economy. That's not something that under current law we would achieve. It's something that additional steps, including greater spending reduction and reducing tax benefits, especially for high-income households, would help us achieve.
Gentleman's time has expired. Senator Casey is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And we have a day when folks are voting, and in the Senate we're voting, so I'll probably have just one question, but I think it's a critically important topic. We could spend hours on this one topic, and I'm glad that you have in your work and in the report and the work of the administration focused on what we sometimes call early care and learning. Early care meaning quality, affordable child care, and learning, of course, pre-kindergarten education. But I noted that, and I think they're both essential, and obviously there's a relationship between the two. I noted on page 4 of your testimony, you said, and I quote, that one of the chapters focuses on, quote, disparities in opportunity that appear at an early age in the long-run benefits of investments in the education, health, and well-being of children. Then you go on to talk about the gaps in the early health and cognitive skills of children. And then you conclude by saying, quote, research demonstrates that direct investments in children can help close gaps in these important outcomes and can have lasting positive effects, unquote. Then you have a chart there about cognitive skills, kindergarten versus 5th grade. I've been working on these issues for years, and I think the connection between learning and earning is is not only demonstrated, but is something we should bear in mind, that if kids learn more now, meaning when they're in those early years, they will literally earn more later, and frankly, we're all better off with that investment. So I guess I wanted to ask you, number one is, just can you walk through some of the benefits that you see, maybe purely from an economic or workforce perspective, on making those investments in children in the dawn of their life?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question and bringing up that issue, because I think that's a really important chapter of the report and a really important example of how we can both promote productivity growth, which we've been talking about in this hearing, and make sure that that productivity growth is shared more widely. When you do an economic analysis of these types of early care programs and early education programs, you find that it has two sets of benefits. One is actually an immediate benefit because it enables the parents, more often than not the mother, to work more if she chooses to do so. And it facilitates greater income for that family, which itself is important for a learning environment for that child. And then the second set of benefits, the ones you've talked about, are a robust connection between education as young as 3, 4, 5 and how much you earn at 25, 30, 35 years of age. And when you look at, for example, just the extra tax revenue collected on those future earnings, that is enough to repay a substantial portion, if not all, of the initial cost of these programs. I'm not suggesting that we take that into account, in the budgetary treatment of them, but in evaluating, whether or not it's a good idea to undertake those programs, that's certainly relevant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know there are a number of studies that show the return on investment, which is really extraordinary. Sometimes it's you spend $1 on high-quality early learning, and you get back multiples of that, sometimes into the teens.
Yep.
So it's significant. I will, in the interest of time, because I have to run the vote, I'll yield back 1 minute and 7 seconds.
Thank you. We appreciate it. Mr. Hannah is recognized for 5 minutes.
Very much. Thank you, Chairman. I want to say that I couldn't agree more with Senator Casey. The Arnie Duncan's Strong Start for Children Act, our past secretaries, I've supported that. I'm pleased to be the lead of that in the House. And every possible matrix suggests that universal pre-K, or as near as we can get to it, is one of the best investments a society can make. But on another matter, you talked about corporate inversions and our high corporate tax rate vis-a-vis other countries, and mentioned that you believe that it's an issue. How would you correct it? Because the issue's been demagogued, I think, by both sides in ways that aren't helpful. Certainly, I have my opinion about it, but what would you like to see happen, Doctor?
Sure. I think there's a good way to address it, and there's an even better way to address it. The good way to address it would be to take a simple step of banning the practice of merging with a smaller foreign company and changing your tax domicile overseas, and thus claiming the set of benefits associated with being an overseas corporation. That's a step we could take today, and it would reduce inversions. The even better way to deal with it would be to do that at the same time that we make it more attractive to invest in the United States by reforming our business tax system, lowering the tax base.
Ultimately, the one
reforming
is
tax rate.
ineffective if you don't do the other.
I think we could do, I think it would be, the inversions are happening so quickly that I don't think we can afford to wait. And if it's going to take a long time to reform the tax code as a whole, then I would just deal with the inversions issue by itself. I think that would be the economically prudent thing to do. The even better thing would be to reform the business tax system as a whole to make it more attractive to be here at the same time that you're making it harder to invert.
Ultimately, I mean, we're talking about larger businesses being co-opted by smaller ones.
Exactly.
But you also can't stop the reverse. And the idea of building an environment that makes it fundamentally attractive to be here, which Chairman Brady supports, I think, is really what we should be considering. And the fact that we have the highest corporate tax rates are among them in the world is a fundamental problem when you look at companies like Pfizer and Johnson Controls and others, and Apple, and the conversation that ensues. I want to ask you, though, about something that I'm disappointed that I'm afraid that we're not going to be addressing this year, and that is a Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I'd like to give you an opportunity to talk about it in any way you'd like, without rendering an opinion if you don't want to, but the idea that we're not taking up this conversation is deeply disturbing to me, regardless of where it goes. So.
Yep, thanks for that. As I said in my opening statement, one of the challenges facing the U.S. economy is that it's hard to increase your exports to a world where growth in the rest of the world is slower. In that environment, one of the steps we could take that could help make it easier for us would be to reduce or eliminate 18,000 taxes that our exporters face when they try to export to abroad, the tariffs that these 11 other countries in the TPP have. One study found not just that there would be substantial benefits from doing TPP, it also found that if you wait a year to do it, you lose $94 billion. You lose more than $600 or $700 per household in our economy. So I think it's not just important to do, it's important to do it as expeditiously as possible.
So, I mean, you've heard the conversation on the street, the unions are deeply against it, yet I find that most people are very much uninformed or misinformed. What do you say to those people, Doctor?
I say the United States is already a very open economy. It's very easy for other countries to sell here. What we're trying to do is break down the barriers that our companies face to countries around the world. We also have very high standards in our country, labor, environment. This would ensure that other countries are raising their standards and put us in a better position to compete on a level playing field.
So that the net is a big benefit.
So then there's a big benefit for workers, a big benefit for productivity, a big benefit for our economy
How come you can't get
overall.
that message out? I mean, it just doesn't seem to be getting any traction.
It's certainly something we've been trying to communicate and really make it tangible that these are about cutting taxes on American exporters, and American exporters support higher paid jobs.
Thank you, Doctor. My time's expired.
My understanding that Congressman Beyer has some questions, and feel free to take whatever time you need. And
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Just two questions. Chairman Furman, on this committee, we have often focused on the lost economic gap between a perceived or a titular 4% growth rate versus the 1, 2, 2.5 that we have. And we look back over most of our lifetimes, we've had higher rates of growth. But I keep reading in various newspapers and magazines that absent some dramatic new disruptive technology, the agricultural revolution, the manufacturing revolution, the IT revolution, that we're destined to long-term growth rates of between 1% and 2%. Your perspective?
Growth rates are a function of two things. One, how much is labor growing, and the second is how much is productivity growing. Labor is growing more slowly now than in the past for demographic reasons. If you look during the 1980s, for example, and you look at the growth of the population between age 25 to 54, this is the group of people most likely to be working, that was 2.3% annually. Now the growth of the population in that age bracket is negative 0.1% annually. This is a pure demographic factor, not talking who's working or not working, or is it just who is alive in that age range. And so the baby boom really helped propel our growth forward. That's turning into a retirement boom. And for that reason, the labor component of growth is lower today and is going to be lower in the future. The second component of growth is productivity, and there's a big debate that you alluded to within the economics profession about what the outlook for productivity growth is. I think, no one really knows, and it depends on what inventions people have in the future, and if I knew what inventions people would have in the future, I'd go out and invent them myself and, probably not be before your committee today. I think there's a lot of reason to think we have a lot of potential. There's a lot of exciting technological developments in our economy, a lot of questions about how to apply them and make sure we're using them as well as possible. But I certainly would feel better if we were investing more in research infrastructure, trade, business tax, all the different steps that we should be taking, lower deficit, all the different steps.
Yeah, thank you very much. One more question. China's lost about $800 billion in currency reserves over the last 12 months. What are your views on the drivers of this capital outflow? Do you expect them to continue? And how about China's reserve adequacy? And really, what's its impact on our economy?
That's certainly a really important question. And China has suffered from not always communicating its policies as clearly and as transparently as we would like to see them do and as the market would like to see them do. And one consequence when you don't have transparent, market-oriented policies that are communicated clearly is that you can see various abrupt changes in financial markets. So I think that's part of what is going on with China. China still has very substantial reserves. They have, I think, more than enough wherewithal to deal with the economic challenges that they face. The question is, are they going to make sure that they're doing the right reforms, the right transparent policies, communicating them in the right way, such that they are taking advantage of those resources to address the challenges they have.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Congressman Graffman.
Yeah, kind of going a little different than the way Congressman Hanna went here. I know there are countries around the world that want to get the kids as soon as possible in the loving arms of the government away from their parents. In your report, you emphasize that Head Start is a good way to improve economic success in children. Your own HHS has found that Head Start has little or no impact in the long run across 22 different measures, and that actually 3-year-olds who attended Head Start were doing worse in math than their peers. Now, I know a while before that, the Brookings Institution, were you affiliated with Brookings at one time? Yeah. Themselves came out with the idea that Head Start really wasn't up to snuff. Given that these studies that show that, maybe Head Start isn't that great, maybe it would have been better to leave the kids with their parents, and Head Start, of course, just aims at the poorer kids, not kids across the board. Why do you keep pushing this daycare stuff to get the kids away from their parents?
In the report, we review several dozen studies conducted of programs over a few decades. And any given study is going to have a different finding. We show that in broad terms, they consistently find positive results. A number of these studies were authored by a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Jim Heckman, from the University of Chicago, who happens to be a Republican as well. That's not relevant for evaluating his research. But I think this is a widely accepted finding in the economics profession. Certainly, high quality is important. You don't want to just do, you want to pay attention to the quality of what you're doing, not just anything.
You're familiar with the Brookings deal too, right? I think it was Brookings. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So there are studies out there, HHS Brookings, that it doesn't work out that well. I'll give you one more question. I am alarmed about the growing income gap in this country. And one of the things that I think contributed to it was the quantitative easing by the Federal Reserve, which as far as I can see is pushing money towards almost the most obscenely wealthy Americans and kind of feeling that you're going to grow the economy that way. I realize you don't have direct control over the Fed, but could you comment, do you think it was a mistake in trying to juice the economy for the Fed, in essence, to financially benefit some of the wealthiest, or I guess wealthiest Americans? I guess their idea was they thought it would trickle down, but do you think that was a mistake? Was there a moral problem with that? Wouldn't you thought it would have been better off if we had kind of debase the currency to at least give money more to the working stiff?
I don't comment on policy actions at the Federal Reserve. We think it's better for them to undertake those independently. but Congress granted the Federal Reserve a dual mandate in terms of employment and inflation, and I think any steps they take consistent with that mandate are ones that I would agree are in the best interest of our country.
So you agree with, am I wrong in thinking the quantitative easing, insofar as it gives an immediate benefit to somebody, gives an immediate benefit to the big Wall Street banks?
There is a large economic literature on the sources of inequality, and I don't think any major economic research thinks that monetary policy one way or the other is an important part of the explanation for changes in inequality.
Okay. Thank you for the additional time, Mr. Chairman.
Congressman Teeberry.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Furman, for being here today and your sincerity on this difficult topic. And I want to associate myself, just to keep in the back of your mind, with what Senator Lee said. And I look at my own experience. I worked at McDonald's, my first job, and I was really excited about 6 months in when I got a minimum wage increase. I got an increase in my pay, which wasn't very much. But the impact, good for me, wasn't so good on the two guys that got hired after me, because they lost their jobs. And I think that's what Senator Lee was talking about. But let me give you a better example of what I was thinking about when he was talking. My next job in high school was pumping gas at a gas station. I'm dating myself here. You can't get anyone to pump gas anymore at a gas station. You do it yourself. And I remember the owner, a small businessman, telling us, most of us in high school and college, that the biggest cost driver of his business was us, and so we better perform. And I didn't have many skills in high school, but I learned how to pump gas. Well, today, that job is gone. In many service areas we find in our economy, employers trying to figure out ways to reduce cost. And one of the few areas through technology that they can reduce cost impacts those high school kids that don't have those skills that they have yet to learn. And we have, in our state of Ohio, and it's reflected really in many other states, more and more individuals with a lack of skills not being able to find those service jobs that once were plentiful when I was a kid. In urban areas, it's even more tragic, where unemployment among Black and Hispanics are double digits. So not a question, just put in the back of your mind, I worry as we have meaningful, well-intended regulations from the federal government that sometimes they have just the opposite effect, which I think was Senator Lee's point of trying to allow for those who have the skill set maybe that I had when I was 16, hadn't yet developed, are being left behind. So just a thought, and thanks for your sincerity again.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Congressman, if you think you were dating yourself on your first job, wait till would I tell you what my first job was? I see Senator Peters has arrived. Senator, just in the nick of time.
Well,
You're on.
well, thank you, Mr.
You haven't
Chairman.
gone to a
I'm
committee meeting in a long time where you walk in, sit down, and the chairman says, "You're on."
I know, I need to do this more often. This is great, so thank you for that. And Chairman Furman, thank you so much for being here as well to talk about issues related to the economy and kind of the future. And actually, I have a question that's looking at some of the long-term structural changes that seem to be occurring in our economy that I think are going to pose some potentially very significant challenges for us in the decades ahead. I enjoyed reading the economic report of the president, which I'm sure most people enjoy reading this book and spending some time with it, but some very interesting discussion about growing income inequality and job dislocations, job creation, dynamism, et cetera. But one issue that you do address, or is addressed in here, and I think you've done some studies related to it as well, deals with the pace of technological change and the impact that that's having on the job market. And I think I heard some of that as I walked in here today. And it has always been, and I'd like your reflections on this and your thoughts, because I think you've thought about this topic quite a bit, is that it has always been that folks have always feared that technology would disrupt jobs would be destroyed, and we would have a much higher unemployment as a result of that, but it's never materialized. As jobs have, or as technology has destroyed jobs, which it has, it's always created even more jobs. They tend to be better jobs. They tend to be higher paying jobs. And a lot of the routine jobs have been displaced by ones that require higher education and skill training. But it seems as if there are a lot of folks who think that we may be getting to an inflection point where the technology is advancing to the point to where even those high-knowledge jobs, creative jobs also can be done with the technology. That you'll have jobs, physicians, for example, when you look at Watson and the medical breakthroughs that are being done with Watson that can diagnose disease perhaps better than most physicians can do it. We know radiologists, there are machines that can do the job probably better than a lot of radiologists can from that technology. That we may be getting to the point, especially with artificial intelligence, that can radically transform the job market. In fact, I know there was a recent study that I was looking at that thought that in the matter of the next decade or two, 50% of the job classifications in this country could probably be done better with some sort of technology than a human can do it, which is disturbing, but it's a challenge. What are your thoughts on that? And if that is indeed something we need to be concerned about, what sort of policies should we be thinking about right now?
So thank you for that, and I think this bears a lot of thought, and I don't think it's a particularly partisan issue. I don't think we have all the answers. I think it's something we all should be grappling with together. To a first approximation, I think one hypothesis you stated is right. For thousands of years, we've invented new machines. They've replaced things people used to do. All the things, most of what people did in the 19th century, they're not doing today. And we're much better off as a country for it. The problem is when that happens really abruptly and when you're not prepared for it, the consequence of that can be one of two things. One is inequality, and the 50% figure, if you break it down by income, it's higher than that if your income is lower, and it's lower than 50% if your income is higher. And if you see a lot of lower wage jobs replaced, that's reducing the demand for those types of workers, that lowers their wages, that raises inequality. So one bad side effect is inequality. The second is, I certainly believe that over time, if you lose a job, you'll be able to find another job and hopefully a better job. If a lot of people lose a job at once, though, that process can be long and painful, and we don't always make it as easy as we should. What we should be doing in this regard is making sure people have more skills to take advantage of so that they're complementing the innovations and benefiting more from them, making sure we have a labor market that's better at moving people from job to job. The President's proposed a wage insurance program that would help get people back on their feet by insuring them against some of the wage loss associated with a job as they move into a new job, and there's probably a lot more than that that we need to do as well, that we need to keep thinking about.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's I guess the challenge with the training as well as technology, particularly with artificial intelligence and what the promise of that is. With that promise are some significant challenges, but it may be difficult to train folks as well in that area. Now, these are not things that I'm worrying about happening in the next year or 5 years or perhaps 10. But at least from some of my reading, it's something we should be very concerned about looking on beyond that. And, for example, I've done a lot of work with autonomous vehicles. I think you've talked about autonomous vehicles, something we're passionate about in Detroit, which will have incredible applications and most importantly will save tens of thousands of lives with the types of technology that will make cars safer, eventually leading to autonomous vehicles. But autonomous vehicles can also have great promise for the economy. Would you talk a little bit about what you see happening with autonomous vehicles and transforming the economy and some of the investments that may be necessary from the federal government to make that happen?
Yeah, no, I think that's an important question. And autonomous vehicles, everyone is interested in them in the world right now. The U.S. car makers are making significant investments. German car makers are, Japanese car makers are, Israeli technology, and the like. And I think that's one reason why it's really important to make sure that a lot of it's happening here. Some of that is a set of state regulations that allow experimentation, allow testing. We already let cars with drivers on the road. That's already quite dangerous. It's often safer to let these cars on the road and to make sure you're not letting your fears get in the way of being able to undertake that type of experimentation. Basic research that, we fund here in Washington is an important complement to the more applied research that's undertaken by the companies that are doing that. Investments in an infrastructure that supports both autonomous vehicles as well as, for example, electric cars and other types. There can often be a chicken and egg problem of, if the infrastructure isn't there, they won't be there. If they're not there, the infrastructure won't be there. Well, the government can play a role, public policy, in overcoming those types of chicken and egg or network externality obstacles to the adoption of a technology. So I think there's a number of different steps that we are thinking about and need to keep thinking about.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Chairman, thank you so much. I'd want to just follow up with one last thing while I have you here. If you could take yourself out of your current job, and let's say you're back at Brookings or teaching at Harvard or whatever, and I came to you and said, we've talked about this runaway mandatory spending, a lot of it related to the aging of the population, the bulge that existed from the baby boom generation. We've done a number of things to address that. We've had sequestration. We've had the the revenue increase that raised income taxes on the highest category. We have, economic growth will help us address that problem, but we still have the impact of this bulge of baby boom generation, and it's going to be with us for several years, and particularly affecting Social Security and Medicare, and the numbers and so forth. And if we were able to summon the will to bring together on a bipartisan, bicameral executive branch working together with, I don't know why this is doing this, maybe my time is up, but what would you recommend in terms of what we do now, or what a next administration, next Congress should be thinking about in terms of addressing the challenge of the long-term problem that we have here, and doing it in a way to preserve the programs, to assure the American people that their retirement benefits are going to be available to them, they're not at risk, their health care entitlements are going to be available to them, so they don't have that concern. What would you recommend if that will was there and they said, we want to go forward? What kind of formula do we have to put in place, particularly given what we've already done, but now what we clearly know that we need to do, and do it in a way that isn't disruptive to the economy or the retirement capabilities and necessities of that generation?
So thank you for that. I think if it was a year from now and I wasn't in the government, I'd tell you, look back at President Obama's last budget. It had lots of great ideas. One of them is Medicare Advantage, having competitive bidding that would set the reimbursement rates rather than setting them the way we do now, which often results in rates that are too high. On drugs, using the same way to purchase drugs for people who are dually eligible for Medicare and Medicaid as we do for people in Medicaid. Reforming the benefit structure in Medicare so that in appropriate ways there's more cost sharing in areas like Part B, home health, reduce the ability of Medigap to blunt some of that cost saving and have more income-related premiums. Those are some of the types of steps we could take in Medicare. What I'd say is in health, I would think, though, broader than just Medicare. I would think of the health system as a whole, both private and public. And the so-called Cadillac tax, or the tax on high-cost employer-sponsored insurance, is, I think, one of the most important steps that we have to slow the growth of private health care, and it also results in additional revenue. And it's based on idea that's been widely supported by both Democratic and Republican economists. I would say more broadly that you want to think of elements of the tax code. If you look at tax benefits, tax preferences, those are technically termed tax expenditures. And My predecessors like Marty Feldstein, Greg Mankiw, and Glenn Hubbard, who served under President Reagan and President Bush, have all said that we should be looking at those because they're also on autopilot. They're also not an efficient way of accomplishing the goals and not a particularly fair way either. So I would bring that into it and curb some of those tax expenditures for high-income households, like the incentives we have for health, housing, and pensions.
Well, thanks for that. I hope we can get to that point without getting there by crisis. I was around in 1983 when Social Security was about ready to go belly up. President Reagan reached out to then Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill. They took it out of politics. They secured about 30 to 35 years of solvency for Social Security. So it has been done, can be done. But the question is, do you have to have the pistol at the temple of the politician in order to get it done? And oftentimes mistakes can be made when you're doing this in crisis form rather than just laying it out and doing it in a logical way, which doesn't end up making mistakes and putting people at risk. So I think that's, I appreciate your giving us that template. Hopefully we can reach that point without getting to a crisis. I really appreciate you coming and being with us today and your continuing availability to the Congress. Working together is the only way we're going to solve this, and you make it easy for us to do, and we appreciate you being here. And with that, well, let me just do a couple of housekeeping things here. We're going to keep the record open for 5 business days so that members can submit anything else that they want to submit, and that would be for you also, if you so desire. And with that, the hearing, with thanks again to you, is adjourned.
Thank you.